Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ya Ali Madad, and good evening. My name is Salima Jaffer, and I'll be your MC and moderator for tonight's event, Climate Change, Understanding the Impact on Health, Agriculture, and Infrastructure. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all here to the Earth Day 2023 celebrations at the Ismaili Centre Toronto. Let's begin by acknowledging the rich and enduring history of Indigenous people in Ontario. We acknowledge that this land we gather on today is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Métis, and the Mississauga of the First Credit. The treaty that was signed for this particular parcel of land is collectively referred to as the Toronto Purchase and applies to land east of Brown's Line to Woodbine Avenue and north towards Newmarket. This territory is also covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the land and its resources. Land acknowledgements are an important step in reconciliation, but the work does not end there. I encourage each of you to learn more about Indigenous people wherever you live and work. For those of you joining us for the first time, this center is a global network of 6 Ismaili centers, each architecturally unique, yet designed to reflect a mood of humility, forward outlook, friendship, and dialogue. Earth Day marks the anniversary of the birth of modern environmentalism movement since the 1970s. Today, Earth Day is widely recognized and marked by more than 1 billion people every year as a day of action to change human behavior and create global, national, and local policy changes. Your participation today reinforces the acknowledgement that there is a need and an urgency for all of us to contribute to the change for a cleaner environment. It is now my pleasure to invite Zakia Qasim, member for Climate Change and Environment, Aga Khan Council for Canada, to the stage to offer opening remarks. Please join me in welcoming Zakia.
Thanks, Salima. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. On behalf of the Aga Khan Council for Canada and the affiliated institutions, I want to welcome everybody to this Earth Day event. And I want to start by sharing with you an excerpt from the Aga Khan Development Network Ethical Framework, and specifically the framework in relation to sustainable development. It says, care for the environment, in its comprehensive meaning, is a duty of trusteeship which humankind owes by virtue of its vicegerency over creation. Each generation of people are described as both viceroys and successors in the earth, stewards over its resources for the benefit of all living beings. So today's event is an exploration of the impact of climate change on our world today, and it's an opportunity for us to reflect as individuals, as a Canadian community, about what is our responsibility, particularly in relation to future generations. So I would like to thank all of our guests for being here today, and our guests for sharing of their time and their knowledge and their thoughts with us, and of course to all of the volunteers who have been pivotal to making this event possible. And for all of you here today, thank you for joining us in this dialogue, which promises to be educational, inspirational, and certainly thought-provoking. Salima.
Let's move to the opening event. It's with great pleasure I'd like to introduce our 4 panelists, Afzal Sovani, Dr. Samantha Green, Jon Lomow, and Rehana Rajabali. If I can please invite you to the stage. This evening, each panelist will start by sharing their experiences and expertise before the panel discussion. But we would appreciate it if audience members would please use the QR codes. Perhaps if we can have those put back up. throughout the presentations and post any questions that you might have. We'll get to those at the end of the presentations. Our first panelist to speak is Afzal. Afzal is a consummate entrepreneur, lecturer, and now best-selling author of a book on climate change called The Heat is On. His experience in the venture capital field spans over 20 years, where his involvement in particular with numerous joint venture projects in the environmental and clean tech industry has provided him with first-hand experience and knowledge in some of the core issues facing the industry and probable solutions. Afzal holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in finance, accounting, and business administration. In addition to being a recipient of numerous awards for community services, he continues to be involved in various capacities on numerous boards of profit and nonprofit organizations. I'd like to call on Afzal now to do his presentation.
What a delight and an honor to be with you all. Thank you all for coming out here tonight and fitting this in your schedule. Thank you also to the organizers and the amazing organizing team for their work and also for the invite. Let me try and get this thing right at the beginning. I'm here, you are here. We are all here to celebrate Earth Day because we care for the planet Earth. Am I correct? Looks like a lot of people like the Earth. What if I told you that for every 2 minutes of energy we get from the sun, the whole world is able to power its industries, its air conditioners, its cars, and electricity for a whole year? And you heard me right, for a whole year. Isn't that just incredible? This is the natural energy coming from the source, from the external source. But we also have an internal source, which is caused by human activity. And the human activity is as a result of our massive consumption, which has no limits. So here is the big problem. Human-induced energy mostly gets re-emitted or gets bounced back to Earth, and this is what causes global warming. The more we do it, the warmer it gets. So as you know, actions have consequences. The panel will soon discuss the consequences and impacts. So let me leave this as a backdrop to our conversation to follow. Now let me tell you what I have been up to for the last while. I have been in entrepreneurship for 20+ years, mainly in the venture capital industry. Having been involved in numerous environmental and clean tech projects, I was able to gain first-hand experience and knowledge on the core issues facing the industry and the probable solutions. Interestingly, these projects have to meet a certain critical balance, and that balance is the balance between return on investment for the shareholders and the overall societal benefits that accrues to the society. So this approach, what we call impact investing, happens to be closely aligned with my overall convictions and value system. So I had a lot of fun doing that, and in the process, got to understand something about the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun, something I must have slept through during my high school and university days. Let me give you some examples of what a venture capital company is usually interested in funding. They're usually interested in funding climate technology projects, which range anywhere from anywhere from renewable energy all the way up to carbon technology, capture technology. And as you will see here, venture capital has made a lot of strides in the last few years, where you have seen billions of dollars flowing into the climate technology sector, which actually represents 25% of all venture capital investments. I want to fast forward now to a few years ago, when I decided to switch gears and cut down my 10 hours a day and go into teaching part-time. With more time on my hands now, I was able to reflect on things, and I started to observe various narratives on climate change on different media platforms. If I did not know any better, they would have convinced me that global warming is just a prediction and not a reality. In fact, climate change is happening right now, and it's a reality. It was then that I had a reckoning. I was sitting at the convergence of business and education, and it was almost a moral imperative for me to break this subject matter down into understandable language and bring awareness on climate change. That way, I would be doing my part, as little as it may be. So I started writing a book just over a year ago. So a few months into writing the book, we received the best news we can ever get. We were going to be grandparents for the first time ever. How awesome and cool that was, not to mention all the benefits that come with it. So as you would imagine, this news got me thinking hard about the next generation and the kind of world we would be leaving behind for them. I was surprised and amazed what I saw in my crystal ball for the next 30 to 50 years for my grandson and his generation. Let me take you through the crystal ball and what I saw there. I saw a lot of hope. I saw a massive transformation of the economy the world has never seen. I saw a new world order that was less polarized out of necessity, I believe. I saw the 30 to 50-year-olds living a clean energy life that was much, much simpler and healthier. Human beings have the capacity, the resourcefulness, and the ability to resolve problems. History has shown that when human beings are faced against the wall, they have always risen up, and they have turned things around for the better. But hold on, my crystal ball also had a warning. It said, for all these good things to happen, we must first rise up with a strong commitment and a discipline, because we owe it to the next generation. So far, as you will see here, our response to climate change has been very lukewarm. With this kind of response, I don't think we can make it. So here is a final thought I want to leave with you. Make no mistake, you as individuals have the ultimate power as a citizen, a voter, and a consumer to make the system-wide changes necessary. You can be contagious through your positive actions and voices. So I say to you, go out and multiply the message. Thank you.
Thank you, Afzal. You set the stage for us for where we are in terms of humanity and a decision that's in front of us, so thank you for setting the stage. Our second panelist is Dr. Samantha Green. Dr. Green is a family physician in downtown Toronto and assistant professor in the University of Toronto's Department of Family and Community Medicine. Dr. Green is president-elect of the Canadian Association for Physicians for the Environment. She advocates for climate action with the aim of improving the health of her patients and community. Please welcome.
So thank you so much for having me today on this panel. I'm so delighted to be here for the first time. So I just wanted to take a step back, and I think these stripes do a really good job of illustrating the problem that we face. These stripes represent global average temperature from 1850 to today. We're currently sitting at about 1.2 degrees of warming, and the latest reports that you may have seen from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change say that we will almost certainly hit 1.5 degrees of warming in the next 10 to 15 years. Those series of reports also said we must act now, as you've already heard, and immediately reduce emissions in order to avoid warming more than 1.5 degrees. And we know that every fraction of a degree above 1.5 could translate into millions more people dying. We also know that as the world warms, we risk reaching tipping points where we could be stuck with irreversible warming incompatible with human life. And current trends indicate, thanks to that little sputter of action, that without a much more determined worldwide response, temperatures will go on rising to at least 3.2 degrees Celsius by the end of this century, which is more than double what the world agreed to in Paris in 2016. And these are the stripes for Canada. Canada is actually warming at twice the global rate, and the Canadian Arctic is warming at 5 times the global rate. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, we're such a small country, it can't matter that much what we do. But Canada is actually responsible for 1.6% of global emissions, which makes us the #9 absolute polluter in the world. And we're among the top 3 polluters per capita. And furthermore, most people, I think, don't recognize that we are among the world's top fossil fuel producers and exporters, and the fossil fuels that we produce and export don't get counted in our own emissions. The emissions get counted where they're burned. So all of those, the oil and gas that we're extracting from the Alberta tar sands and exporting elsewhere, that does not even count in that 1.6% #9 emitter. So why am I here? Why am I here as a family physician? Why am I spending, 40% of my time, I would say, on climate advocacy? And that's because climate change is the biggest threat to health that we face, notwithstanding the global pandemic that we've been living through. But actually, this was first declared by the Lancet, the World Health Organization, and even actually the current Governor General of the UN, I forget his title, Antonio Guterres, has called climate change the biggest threat to health that we face. So how does climate change affect health? Well, you may be aware that, of course, health is determined by more than just the work that I do in healthcare. And in fact, 50 to 60% of your health is determined by the ecological and social and structural determinants of health. So your income, your education, the work that you do, and also the environment that you live in. And really, without a stable planet, none of the rest of it matters. Like, your metformin for your diabetes, that just won't matter if we're not living on a stable planet. So specifically, I'm going to go through some of the health impacts briefly. So, most obviously, there's an increase in extreme heat, and extreme heat particularly affects the elderly, small children, and those with chronic medical conditions. And extreme heat poses the direct threat of heat exhaustion, heat stroke, but it also worsens common chronic diseases, including asthma, diabetes, kidney disease, and mental health, with an overall increase in mortality seen during extreme heat. Also, many common medications put people at risk of heat-related illness, so blood pressure pills, antidepressants, even allergy medications can affect the body's ability to regulate temperature. And of course, you must remember the heat dome event that hit British Columbia in 2021, which killed more than 600 people in just 5 days. And of course, you know, BC is not alone in this risk. In Toronto, extreme heat days are expected to more than double, maybe even triple by 2040. Climate change also leads to an increase in wildfires globally, which cause direct physical injury, significant mental health impacts, and also, of course, the poor air quality can worsen respiratory diseases, also heart disease. So we see an increase in heart attacks during wildfire season. There's also perinatal, like pregnancy outcomes, like low birth weight, and worse diabetes control. And you know, just as an example, the Fort McMurray wildfire of 2016 resulted in a doubling of ER visits during that time, and actually an increase in inhaler prescriptions by 400%. There are cyclones, tropical storms, floods, all of which cause direct physical injury, mental health impacts. Also, they can result in a lack of access to water, sanitation services, and health care. And flooding can also result in an increase in waterborne illness, waterborne infectious disease. Changing weather patterns also change vector-borne diseases. So we know that Lyme disease is creeping northward, and globally there's been an increase in malaria, West Nile virus, dengue, and Zika. And there's also a link between climate change and the risk of pandemics. So as there's a change and a shift and a destruction of biodiversity, then we see an increased proximity between humans and animal vectors of disease, and that will lead to future pandemics. With milder winters, we also see an extension of the allergy season and an increase in allergy-related disease. And then finally, the biggest two impacts on health are actually indirect. So, you know, with the changing climate, we've seen an increase in displacement globally, which of course has a huge impact on mental and physical well-being, and can also disrupt access to health care services. And you may know that climate change-related drought and famine was one factor in the Syrian refugee crisis, and ongoing drought and hurricanes in Central America are contributing to the migrant crisis there. But migration is not just limited to, you know, Syria, Honduras, Bangladesh. Climate displacement is also already happening in North America. You may remember the town of Lytton, BC, which was completely destroyed by wildfires in 2021. And then the biggest health impact, actually globally, of climate change is undernutrition. We're already seeing an increase in lands affected by drought, and then we are seeing a change already in crop yields globally. So this is from an annual report published by The Lancet, which is a prestigious British medical journal. So they publish every November the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change, and so this graph is from the 2021 report. And so those are the health impacts, and those whose health is most affected by climate change are those who are already most vulnerable and marginalized. Indigenous people, racialized people, people living in poverty, others who are politically marginalized. This photograph represents a patient of mine who has severe asthma, lives alone in a St. Jamestown high-rise apartment, has very sporadic contact with his kids who live out in Brampton, and he has, severe asthma. So for many summers in a row, I would worry that he would just die alone in his hot apartment, perhaps of an asthma exacerbation. Finally, we were able to find money for an air conditioner, so I worry about him a little bit less, but it's patients like him, people like him, who are most at risk. And generally, those with low income are less able to cope with rising food prices, less likely to have insurance or money to rebuild or relocate after an extreme weather event, and racialized and poor communities are also less likely to have access to trees and parks, which reduce the risk from heat, actually. So there's something called the urban heat island effect, which can increase temperatures up to 12 degrees without adequate tree cover. So that was all doom and gloom. But tackling climate change could also be our biggest opportunity for health of the 21st century. And that's because, first of all, tackling climate change will reduce the significant illness that's associated with, of course, the climate disasters themselves, but also, second, the significant illness that's associated with air pollution. So 1 in 5 deaths globally is caused by air pollution. 1 in 7 premature deaths in Canada is caused by air pollution. So if we tackle climate change, we're going to tackle those premature deaths. And then finally, many of the solutions we need to tackle the climate crisis will have additional health benefits. So for example, an increase in active transportation and an improvement in active transportation infrastructure will have a direct impact actually on mortality. So there's a direct link between cycling and decreased mortality, also less heart disease, less diabetes, and improved mental health. And transportation is responsible for 28% of Canada's emissions, so there's a significant opportunity there. And an increase in promotion of plant-rich diets and an increase in access to plant-rich diets will also improve health. It's been shown and linked to a decreased risk of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and it's also been shown to reduce emissions. So beef is the #1 source of emissions from the food sector. So if we can even just reduce the amount of beef that we consume, we'll have a huge impact on emissions and we'll also improve our own health. And then finally, an increase in urban green spaces, you already heard, will improve the impacts of heat by reducing urban heat islands. And also, access to nature overall improves well-being. So access to nature, so spend 2 hours a week, 20 minutes at a time in nature, and you'll see an improvement in your mood, your energy levels, your sleep, your concentration. It's actually an effective treatment for ADHD, depression, improves confidence levels, and so increased access to urban green spaces and also increased nature protection, all told, we'll see an improvement in our emissions. We'll actually sink carbon into the earth. We'll reduce temperatures and also is good for health. And I already alluded to this, but meeting the targets of the Paris Climate Agreement would be expected to save over 1 million lives a year from air pollution alone by 2050. So that's my last slide. Just to conclude, in the words of Dr. Nick Watts, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer for the NHS, England's National Health Service, he has said, "We have a choice to drift into the greatest global health threat we've ever faced or to embrace the greatest opportunity we've ever had to build a better world. The decision to act is entirely political."
Thank you, Dr. Green, for connecting the dots for us for how climate change can affect our health and some of the opportunities that we have in front of us. We just have to make the right decisions, right? Our third panelist, Jon Lomow, is a multiple entrepreneur and has spent his career developing innovative ideas and organizations that push beyond the typical to forge new ways of solving complex commercial, societal, and environmental problems. He has provided leadership or senior advisory services to organizations ranging from startups and nonprofits to multi-billion-dollar projects. He is a big thinking doer that approaches challenges with a sustainability mindset and a communications lens. Jon is currently the CEO and co-founder of Fieldless, a Canadian modern food and controlled agriculture company in pursuit of food sovereignty and sustainability. Jon.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. I got a nice tour of the museum today, and it was awesome. Hi, I'm Jon, and I'm a farmer, kinda. I'm a longtime intra and entrepreneur, which basically just means that I have an unhealthy relationship with risk, and I'm annoyingly optimistic. I've spent a lot of time in a number of different sectors and startups and established large organizations as well, but food has always really captivated me. So this is a warehouse in Cornwall, Ontario. Well, it was a warehouse and now it's a farm. And inside it looks something like this. We grow leafy greens at an industrial scale using renewable power to displace imported greens. So that means less food miles, less waste, no soil erosion, more efficient use of fertilizers, and a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So today you can buy our product in Farm Boy stores across Ontario. I don't know if anybody here has maybe had it before, hopefully, because if our product doesn't knock your socks off, then all the things I just said don't matter. And that's an important thing in terms of my philosophy when you're trying to address these problems. So why are we doing this? Canada now has the fastest growing population in the G7. It's the 5th largest food importer, which is great, but also it's the 5th largest food exporter, which is great, but we're the 6th largest importer, not so great, and very risky. It means we're without the food that we import, we'd be forced to eat a very, very limited diet. Globally, we need 70% more food by 2050 to feed the population that's projected, and Canada's growing population will have to compete for that food if we don't get there. But we import $50 billion a year worth of food, and that's a huge economic opportunity. So agriculture and climate change are a negative cycle, or basically a vicious cycle, and that cycle needs to be broken. Agriculture has a massive impact on the environment on which it actually depends. So when climate impacts agriculture, like with droughts or floods or extreme weather, we get supply shocks, which leads to scarcity and inflation, which is something we're pretty familiar with these days. Anyway, I think you get the point. This is a really big problem. I only have a few minutes, so I don't really want to dwell on the problem. I really want to just kind of talk a bit about why I'm optimistic. And I'm not, it is a massive problem, but without optimism, I think we have nothing. So quickly, pop quiz, what is the most important invention in human history? Anyone? Sorry? The wheel? Maybe? Anyone else? Sorry? Combustion engine? Pretty close. So I would debate with anybody that the most important and impactful invention of human history is the Haber-Bosch process. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. Plants need nitrogen to grow, and most plants do a very poor job of actually synthesizing nitrogen, which is mostly found in the air, in order to grow really large. They can grow small without it. And so about 100 years ago, a guy named Fritz Haber invented synthetic nitrogen by combining hydrogen, mostly from natural gas, with nitrogen found in the air, using basically heat and pressure. And then a guy named Carl Bosch in 1931 kind of improved and perfected the process. We've been kind of perfecting it ever since. But without this process, we could probably only feed about half the world's population right now. So think about that. 4 billion people would not be able to eat without this process. We wouldn't have that population without it. And that's the pink dotted line you can see that goes through that chart. So we're heading towards 8 billion people. We're basically there. We're heading towards 9 billion quite quickly. And without Haber-Bosch, we wouldn't be able to do it. And so the reason I'm showing you this is that humans are incredible. We've made massive innovation like this in agriculture before, and we need to do this again, but now with the guide rails of sustainability. It's not likely going to be one single invention, I don't think, that's going to get us there. It's going to be a multitude of things, but we need radical ideas. Sorry, is it coming? Is there anything up there? No. So, if you don't know these stats, this may blow your mind a little bit. 4% of all the mammal biomass on Earth is wildlife. So that includes large ones like elephants and whales. 34% is humans. 62% of all the mammal wildlife on Earth are domestic animals that we cultivate mostly to eat. A very small portion of that would be like horses and camels and stuff, but the most part, those are animals we eat. So it's clear that either we need to eat fewer animals or we need to find a way to cultivate animal protein, or both. So humans started as hunter-gatherers, and then in the early 1900s started to move away from hunter-gathering and basically cultivating crops and animals. And so they, cities were able to evolve around that. They developed tools and techniques, and that basically set modern agriculture into motion. And this paved the way for like the Industrial Revolution, basically. Then the combustion engine was invented, and farmers could do a whole lot more with a lot less, which was a good thing because this was about the time that Haber-Bosch, the Haber-Bosch process was really starting to kick in, and they were having a lot more to do. And so basically there was more variety being introduced to the diet, and the modern diet began to emerge. And then we had the Green Revolution, which many of you may have heard of before, kind of centered around the invention of dwarf wheat, which basically helped, put a significant dent in world hunger. A guy named Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Prize for it. We got even better at this, even better at synthesizing fertilizers, like I said, and improving the genetics of crops at this point. And this era brought us, the multinational agricultural companies that we know today. So we're now entering a fourth era. I call it Farming 4.0, and it's really defined by our ability to control with precision almost all aspects of growing food. And everything from the biology to the chemistry to the environments that they're grown in, as well as the supply chain that delivers them. So farming will really become a lot more like manufacturing. We talked already a little bit about venture capital. Venture capital is an incredible invention of humanity. It is a wonderful engine of innovation, probably the most important engine of innovation over the last several decades. And it tends to flock to areas that have massive potential. And you can see by this graph, it is flocking to ag tech, and it is flocking to food tech. The deal size is really staggering. The deals that are happening, the amount of money flowing into the sector is truly staggering. As someone who follows it closely, I get overwhelmed by it. So I'm not going to go through each of these in depth, and if people want to talk about them during the conversation, I'm happy to. But these are the categories I see as solving the problems. On the left, we have the categories in agriculture, and on the right, what I call the exponents or the X factors, which are going to be the multipliers that get us to the solution in a timely way. Humans tend to always overestimate what can be done in a year, and so it seems like progress is always slow. And this is a really important point I want to make. We really underestimate what can happen in 10 years. And then all of a sudden things seem to kind of happen out of nowhere. We've kind of seen that happen with AI over the last, 3 months. And we've been working on AI for over a decade. It's been a long time coming, and then all of a sudden like that, it's impacting everybody. It's probably the fastest thing we've ever brought on to humanity. And this is because we live in an exponential time. So over the long term, things change much more quickly than we can comprehend. Radical ideas never seem like they can succeed, and that's why they're radical. Human history is just one radical idea after another, disrupting the things that we thought were possible. So, yes, I'm an optimist. It might be genetic. This is a fictitious graph, though, that illustrates how layering all these innovations that I kind of put on the screen there does get that compounding effect to give you those exponential returns and quickly, after a slow start to make a real impact, which is a really good thing because we're really, really, really going to need it. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for sharing the evolution of agribusiness and for sharing your optimism. Last but not least, our final panelist, Rehana Rajabali, is the Associate Director of Engineering Services for the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority She leads a team of professionals who work towards mitigating natural hazard risks to communities and protecting the natural environment. Her role encompasses the flood risk management portfolio, where her team delivers programs and projects to reduce the risk of flooding to people and property, including large-scale flood infrastructure projects, flood forecasting, warning systems, public education, and community climate adaptation strategies. Rehana completed her undergraduate studies in civil engineering at the University of Waterloo and has her master's degree in urban design from University of Toronto. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here. Now that we've heard from the other panelists about the compelling case and the need to undertake mitigation and the urgency of it and how the heat is on, I'd like to take us into a little bit of a deep dive on the adaptation side of things. And, to help us understand what does this changing climate, which is happening, mean for our infrastructure systems, both natural and man-made. All right. There are things that we understand about the changing climate. We saw the bar graphs that Samantha illustrated. We've understood that we are getting warmer. Things are getting wetter. Weather is getting wilder. This is how I would summarize the changing climate here in Canada. And what this means, as far as impacts go, is that we're going to see more extreme heat days. We've heard about this. Warmer average temperatures, more annual precipitation, more rainfall happening throughout the year, but also a change in the seasonality of precipitation. We can expect to see unseasonable weather, more freeze, thaw, freeze, thaw. And each of these things has an impact on our infrastructure systems. When I talk about an impact, I'm not just talking about what it means in terms of the repair cost of infrastructure, because all of this as citizens impacts you and I as well. I'm talking about the potential loss of service of these infrastructure systems on which we rely. And that can be direct loss of service, when a property gets flooded and when your home is not available. But it can also be indirect, when there isn't sufficient electricity to actually run the air conditioning, and the extreme heat day on which that thunderstorm also happened to happen is now impacting not just the people whose homes are inundated, but also the people whose air conditioning isn't working because there's no electricity. So these things impact you and I, and when it impacts the infrastructure, it has a very tangible impact on people's health and people's property. Now, when we talked about these changing climate, I talked about, for example, more freeze-thaw cycles in the winter. Each of those dimensions has an impact on our infrastructure. The more you have freeze and thaw, the more you have stresses on the structural components of infrastructure. That puts stress on concrete, that puts stress on pavement. It makes it last less long. An example of more extreme precipitation events means more rainfall in a short amount of time, and that can overwhelm our storm source. When we have warmer winters, there's less ice that forms along the shores of the Great Lakes. And without that anchor ice in the wintertime, those windstorms will start to cause more erosion along the trails that are along our waterfront. Now, the issue is that we understand that there are going to be impacts, but it's not straightforward as to how these impacts are going to play out. In some cases, we understand it well. I'll take a deeper dive in flooding because that is, of course, my bread and butter. Everybody's seen that picture of the polar bear on that piece of ice. When it comes to coastal flooding, we have a better sense of what that impact might be because the process is a little more straightforward. Warmer weather, warmer water means less ice, means at a higher sea level. And so when it comes to coastal flooding, we have a lot more certainty around that expectation. Water levels are going to rise, average sea levels are going to rise, and that puts coastal communities at risk. Exacerbating that, we also have the risk of flooding that comes from storm surge. Storm surge is when you have a hurricane or an intense low pressure system where that pressure difference or all that wind basically pushes that water inland along coasts. And with greater intensity, with warmer air temperatures and these greater kind of changes to the water temperature pattern, there's the potential for more intense hurricanes, and that can make storm surge flooding even more intense as well. So in some cases, there's a more straightforward understanding of what that impacts are going to be. But in other cases, we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. We just know it's going to get wilder. And a good example of that is what I call urban or pluvial flooding. That's when there's more rainfall than an urban drainage system can handle, right? And while we understand that the literature expects to see more intense rain. The reason for this, of course, is when you have warmer temperatures overall, the carrying capacity of that air in terms of rainfall is higher. You can get more precipitation, more moisture in that air, and all of that can come down at once. And so there's an expectation to see these greater extremes, but it's not like I can pinpoint and tell you exactly how much rainfall that next bad storm is going to be. And when it comes to river flooding, there's kind of impacts that happen concurrently, which can have differing effects on that. In a city like Toronto, where a lot of the river flooding is caused by intense rainfall events, irrespective of the season, and worst was in the fall, we've had bad ones in the summer, that the risks and the change in risk is going to be similar to what we talk about with urban drainage systems. But in other areas where the river flooding is dominated by winter snowmelt, we have expectations to see less snowpack accumulating in the winter, but then at the same time, we expect to see more rainfall happening in the winter. How these things will combine to change the risk profile of flooding is not a very certain bet. And this is perplexing for engineers. This is perplexing for people like me because there are a lot of things we don't know. Like I said, I can't tell you the exact amount of rainfall that's going to make up what we call 1 in 100 year storm in the future, what an extreme value in the future represents. I can't also tell you the exact number of times we will see an extreme storm in a given year. I should put this to ChatGPT, though, just to see what AI has told us about it so far. We're getting there, right? It's not that we can't answer it. It's just that you have to design infrastructure today to deal with the problems of tomorrow. And the science, the climate science around these nitty-gritty things just isn't quite there yet. But we still have to make these decisions today. Shovels are in the ground. Projects today have to be designed with that possible uncertainty in mind. And so, like I said, these are perplexing. And to me, as an engineer, as an infrastructure designer, the issue not from the mitigation side, but the adaptation side, the issue that climate adaptation poses for me is this idea of non-stationarity. We used to look at the climate trends of the past to assume what the extreme values of the future will be. But with the change in climate, we can't do that anymore. What was the extreme envelope of the past isn't necessarily the envelope of the future, but I don't have the data to be able to pinpoint what those numbers are. I like A plus B equals C types of equations, and this is very perplexing to have to work in a kind of environment where that isn't necessarily the case anymore, because you still have to come up with a design number. You still have to make a decision on what your level of protection is going to be. And so how do we move forward in this era of uncertainty? Well, the answer is that there's no silver bullet, right? There are no silver bullet adaptation answers. You have to layer different elements of adaptation together. And all of this relates to, climate risk, because the thing to recognize is that our infrastructure is and has been susceptible to weather-related risks. But climate change is now like an X factor on top of that, right? And it exacerbates the susceptibility to these risks. And so you really have to look at all phases of emergency management, all phases of risk management: prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And like I said, it's not just about the damage to the infrastructure itself, but it's the potential loss of function of that infrastructure. Now, as Samantha actually alluded to in her talk, some of the most effective measures are system scale. Actions that we can take, even from an adaptation side, that can help us out with mitigation as well. Or from an adaptation side, that help us tackle multiple of these risks. And an example of that is, when we keep people away from risks, in this case by leaving room for the river, by not putting people in floodplains as our policies require here in Ontario. By doing that, it makes room for the river. But making room for the river, if you've noticed, if you've taken a look at a map of Toronto and noticed how you have all of these ravines in here, making room for the river also makes room for riparian habitat. It makes room for those ecosystem benefits. It makes room for green space. It makes room for places that reduce that urban heat island effect. And so it's always important to remember that the most effective measures are system scale. The other thing we have to do is start to understand and accept this idea of designing with uncertainty and recognize that you can base your design levels based on policy, best practice, cost-benefit analysis, the mentality that Jon alluded to about how, where investment goes, and smart investment also wants you to take a look at what these future risks are going to be. And so you have to, pick a design level based on one of those things, but also recognize that you've got to have emergency preparedness, because there's always a potential of a combination of factors that you did not plan for. And we have to be able to be adaptable to those situations as well. But it may be as simple as using approximate approaches. In some cases, we don't know what that exact answer is. In a lot of cases, what we do is say, add 20% more flow to whatever it is you're doing, because we may not have the science to be able to answer the question, but we do understand that that risk and that uncertainty is going to be there, and so we allow space for that uncertainty in our design, and we remember to use the rest of the emergency management spectrum to manage it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rehana, for sharing how climate change may impact infrastructure, people, nature, and how difficult it is to design for it. We're going to start soon with the panel portion of the session. If everyone can put their questions forth, that would be great. There is a QR code. If we can get the QR code posted up so that the audience can post their questions, that would be fantastic. So I'll start off with a couple of questions, and then hopefully we get some audience participation here. The sixth assessment synthesis report of the Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change released last month, it noted among the key barriers to adaptation, lack of citizen engagement and a low sense of urgency. Why do we think that is, and how can we change that? I'm going to pose that first. I'll go in sequence. Dr. Green.
Okay. I think we've been hit with multiple crises recently, and I think people have understandably been overwhelmed by global pandemic, amongst many other problems. And the issue, of course, with climate change is it does seem like a future issue, when in fact we now know. I mean, we know it's an issue of today. It's an issue that's already affecting our health today. I think it's not often connected in the media to health, even though it is a health crisis. I think it's also, even amongst health professionals, the link is not always clear. It's not clear, like, you have COVID, I can do a test. You have climate-related illness, you can't really do a test. And it's this like gradual increase in, the heat-related illness, the allergy, the Lyme disease. I guess that's a couple of problems. Like, we can't make that direct link necessarily. And I mean, we've seen that, I think, in the last few decades around storms. Like, news journalists were always hesitant to say this was caused by climate change. I think we're seeing that, thankfully, disappear because it's becoming more clear. But yeah, so the link is not always clear, and then it's just out of mind because it's not this immediate crisis that's in your face like the COVID-19 pandemic was. With the second half of the question, what can we do? I think what we need is a shift in our framing. So we need to frame this as a health issue. We need to also frame this as an opportunity and not only a threat. Because people tune out when it's only a threat. They don't want to hear about it. So it needs to be framed as an opportunity for health, as I presented, but also an opportunity in agriculture, in various fields, an opportunity even in design to be designing better. And I also think an opportunity actually to just restructure our society, because that's what we need, right? We need to electrify everything, and we need to shift completely off of fossil fuels like in the next 10 years. And so what we need is to therefore fund that. I think we need to publicly fund that, so that will actually see an abundance of new jobs. That will see. So instead of telling people you need to cut back, no more, using the dryer, you got to cut back on your electricity. Actually, what we need is abundance. So abundance of health, abundance of green space, abundance of healthy foods, and the abundance of green jobs also.
Thank you. I saw Jon nodding a lot, so I was hoping he could add on to that.
I'm not sure how much I can add to that. That's pretty much the answer I would give. Yeah, I mean, it's been the long time problem for the environmental NGO movement. almost eating itself, trying to solve this problem through constraints. And it's what the UN protocol has been centered around ever since the beginning. It is all around constraints and driving constraints so that we can drive down greenhouse gas emissions, when truly what we need is abundance of clean solutions. If we had an abundant clean energy system at this point, then we would be building everything off of that, and we'd be far more sustainable than we are today. But people tune out when you ask them to constrain, and so yeah, I really do see it as an opportunity, and I think that framing's kind of just becoming more and more pervasive as well. But yeah, I mean.
So do we think the impetus should come from government?
Well, I mean, so climate is, the problem with climate change is it's kind of the perfect storm for inaction, I should say, in that it's far out, and so it's hard for people to wrap their heads around. In addition to that, this is the problem that's always been dealt with when trying to communicate about climate, is people are living their lives, and parents have kids, and they're really focused on the short term. How are my kids' grades? How are they doing day to day? How am I putting food on the table for them? All those things, and it's really hard to ask somebody to change their behavior when they're really focused on those kind of day-to-day life things, and so. The government has to play, obviously, a role in that. Business has to play a role in that. I think it's less about individuals making individual changes. I think as individuals, we need to be optimistic about the solutions coming. We need to support those solutions as opposed to being negative about, I think a really good example is, say, lab-grown meat. I think a lot of people just discount it because it's expensive. And like I said, we live in exponential times, and there's a very good chance that it will surprise us, and it will become palatable, and it will become cost-effective. And I do think there is potential. And so be optimistic and provide those signals to government. But the perfect storm is that governments and democracies change. And they live on typically around a 4-year cycle, and so climate change action doesn't play out in a 4-year cycle, and that's the other big challenge.
Rehana had a very thoughtful look, so I think you have something to add to that.
I think so, John. And you hit on the fact that people tend to get busy. They're overwhelmed by the current crisis. They're worried about putting food on the table and whatnot. And I think what we have to do is start to work it into the decision-making process that people have every day, right? And some of us inherently think about this. This is, of course I think about, if you're purchasing a home, what are the risks, there? If you're looking at food security for your kids to put that on the table, what are the risks of that? In these decisions that we start to make, often, it's the pocketbook that guides it, but these two things are related, right? We talked about how it drives, there is an event, and then there's scarcity, and then it drives the prices up. These things are related, but I think we have to look at our decision-making framework. A lot of times you hear about, the old triple bottom line analysis. How long has that been, in the vernacular, right? Ages. But even as individuals, I think we have to start to look at climate risk, and both the mitigation and the adaptation side of it in our everyday decision making, in the purchases that we make as individuals, in the decisions that we make as individuals, and in the things that we advocate for, both where when it comes to where we're investing, when we're lobbying for the governments, to look at policies, the policies that we ourselves can implement. I think it's that shift in thinking, and say it's a wicked problem, it's a cross-cutting problem, but that doesn't mean it's not insurmountable, right? It's just one that you weave it into the fabric of your everyday decisions.
The tough part about that is it's very hard for people to wade through those decisions. They're complex. They're very nuanced. It's not, even like buying local, generally good, almost always, but there will be times when it's not the best decision. And so it is super nuanced, and this is where government has to play a role. It actually has to step up and make those decisions clear for consumers?
That's actually, I was going to jump in just, so the government not only has to like make regulations and, charge for carbon and all of those things, but actually I think the government also plays a role in educating the population. And I think they did a terrible job at the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think the public health messaging on that was terrible, continues to be terrible. So I don't know if I'm hopeful about climate communications coming from the government, but I do think that there is probably a role to play for public communication on this issue.
I think that there is still a psychological distance with climate change that we have. And there is a perception out there that climate change is still a far away thing. So as to what we should do about that, I agree with everything all the speakers said and what Dr. Green said about health. I wanted to add that we should make a business case. And the way you make a business case is really to show the scale of the problem, the size of the problem, and at the same time, show the solution. And that empowers somebody to go and tackle that problem. So we have to empower the citizens to really be able to tackle that problem, and it has to be made real. At the same time, I think there is a messaging problem in my opinion, especially where the government is concerned. The messaging, could be a lot better. And let me give you an example. An example is, when some years ago, you heard Beyonce, the singer, Beyonce said that I'm going to become a vegetarian. Now, that went over so well compared to all the ads that the government had put that eat less meat. So it is the messaging and the redirecting by showing an actual action and showing the scale of the problem and showing that you have the capacity and you are empowered to do it.
I mean, people have done that. People have made the business case. It's going to be incredibly expensive to not adapt, and to not act. The cost of inaction is in the trillions and trillions of dollars. Nicholas Stern said we need to be investing 2% of GDP per year in climate solutions, and no government
which is nothing.
Which is nothing, and no government is doing it except for Norway and Denmark.
Yeah.
Well, I see we've got quite a few questions, but I've got one more before we wade into the audience. When we did sort of touch about it a little bit, earlier this year the federal government released Canada's Natural Adaptation Strategy, which sets goals for health and well-being, infrastructure, disaster resilience, economy, and workers. Most cities have also issued resiliency strategies. Do our governments have this? They got it covered? And what challenges do we think Canada is going to have to be resilient? I think, Rehana, you want to go first?
Sure, as the public servant in the room. We're all public servants, but as the titled public servant in the room, I think it would be naive to think any particular government has got this. And I think there is so much farther to go, even as it comes to these ideas of adaptation strategies. I just illustrated how challenging, and John mentioned how nuanced, right, that decision making is. So I think it is very naive to think that any government has got this. I also think it's naive to assume, absolutely the government has that pace setting, policy setting role to play. But I do think it is naive to think that it is a problem that will be solved by one sector or another, right? And I think that is, so the answer is no. But no, not criticizing a particular one. I don't know any government that's got this, right? And I think if anything, it should be unifying, right? The fact that this is this wicked problem should this not be the thing we rally around to recognize where you need civil society, where you need, venture capital investment momentum, where you need, the heightened awareness around healthcare to rally around it, right? Should this not be that point?
Yeah. I would start by saying that Canada is tall and wide, so it has complex problems. And for the government to come for the first time and have this national adaptation policy, I think that's a significant step forward. However, as Rehana also mentioned, we have a long way to go. Canada is very different than the rest of the world. Canada is warming twice as fast. In fact, in some places, 3 times as fast as the rest of the world. So it has a lot of problems, and we should already be resilient ready already, which we are not. So we are lagging behind. And so our problem and our challenge is to leapfrog. And when you leapfrog, and based on my background and orientation, the first thing that comes to my mind is all roads lead to money. And the adaptation policy right now of the federal government, and also contained in this particular strategy paper, is quite inadequate. It is 13% of the total climate change budget, which is very, very small. I understand the government has acknowledged that they would mobilize this, but that's an area that we have a challenge. And I think that the best policy is, when you have more mitigation, then adaptation is easy. But mitigation takes a long time. It takes decades. So if we are going to wait for mitigation, adaptation is what we have to do and make changes right now. And we have to anticipate changes also to come. So we have a mismatch. We have a mismatch of policy, and I think all the provinces, territories, the national indigenous groups, all of them have to come together and really find a solution. It's not an easy solution. Thank you.
Jon, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add, but I do agree, that if you want to look at, you go look at the insurers and the reinsurers, they have been focused on this issue for 20 years or more. And, they've kind of been that canary in the coal mine, and they've been spending money, they've been lobbying government. So it's, it's not like nothing has been happening. I think the water's been building against the dam in a way.
It's the loss of dollars that's driving.
And the loss of the potential loss of dollars, and now that's becoming real because they're starting to realize massive losses over extreme weather over the last several years. But they saw this coming, and they were trying to get ready for it. I'm not sure that they fully did or could, but the engine of investment is really a big part of this solution. And investment's going to gravitate towards where public sentiment is and where public policy is, and so those are the two pieces that are going to drive it.
And where risks are lower.
What's that?
And where risks are lower.
And where risks are absolutely where risks are lower.
Every dollar spent on adaptation will save you $15 in the future, and this is what the experts tell us. And in fact, what they tell us is that by year 2025, which is just, 3 years from now, by year 2025, Canada will be losing $25 billion, as a result of climate change. And that is equivalent to 50% of the GDP growth that they are predicting for 2025.
We've basically decided to do this the hard way, the expensive way.
Okay, we'll move on to an audience question here. Climate change presents challenges on a number of fronts: carbon emissions, a shift to EVs, a need for more green space. Could each panelist share what risks or impacts we have that aren't discussed enough? It's a great question, though. Okay. Do you want to start?
I gladly start because I feel like I'm going to do a sales job for the business that I'm in, but food sovereignty is absolutely, I think, a big one, where Canadians just don't realize the Canadian government, and I'm not talking about this government in particular, the government for decades has focused our food policy on exports. We have so much land, but we have a limited climate, like limited to what we can grow because of the climate. And so we've always focused on, growing pulses and grains and things like that. And we've gotten really good at it. We spent a lot of money on it, and we've really focused our attention to become one of the 5th biggest exporter in the world. And so because, for decades, globalization was there, free trade was in place, we've enjoyed that's been a great strategy, right? We've managed to be really efficient at growing a bunch of stuff, and then there's a bunch of stuff we want that we don't grow, and we have to import those things. I think there was a really good example during the pandemic when Indonesia is by far the largest exporter of palm oil, which is essential, super unhealthy, but is essential for most of the things we eat. And for a period there, they got really concerned about their own supply because of COVID shutdowns and things like that, and they shut off the tap. And palm oil prices skyrocketed. And that had knock-on effects, and there were so many of these things through COVID that we got to see. It was almost like a dry run, where we got in a really condensed period, we got to see like all the effects that climate change was going to eventually instill. And so I think, that's one of the major things, is we're not understanding as Canadians the level of food insovereignty that we have in this country. And if we want to eat a complete diet the way we enjoy it today and not make sacrifice, we're really going to need to figure out how to grow or cultivate all those things locally. Because when we're competing on a global stage for food supply, and you're a country and it's limited and you grow it, you're likely going to keep it in your borders. And so I think that dynamic is going to play out in the future in a very bad way.
That's great. Afzal, do you have a...
Yeah, I think what's not really talked about, and it's more potent than carbon dioxide that we talk about. Methane is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide, and not only that, methane stays in the atmosphere for maybe 10, 12 years, but carbon dioxide stays there for centuries.
Just I don't want to interrupt you, but this is a really important point, and it's been a pet peeve of mine for decades. The way accounting is done, carbon accounting is done, is on a 100-year basis, because that's what CO2 lives in the atmosphere. And methane is gone after about 20 years for the most part. And so the way that accounting works is they normalize that 20 years over the 100-year baseline. And so methane, until recently, it started to be recognized the way you're talking about it. Until recently, it's been seen as a 23 factor around there compared to CO2. But in actuality, in a 20-year period, it's 80. And we don't have 100 years to act. And so this little nuance has skewed carbon accounting for decades. I just want to make that, because you're making a really important point.
Perfect, that's correct. And also, while methane stays there for 10 to 12 years, and maybe that's the reason why, climate scientists think that that's not an important thing, or else because 10 to 12 years, who is going to benefit? If we are going to focus on methane, it is us in our lifetime who is going to benefit from that, not the next generation. And I believe that's the reason why maybe that's not talked as much.
And just to jump in, because most people don't know this, natural gas is methane. Yeah. So you currently probably are cooking, you may be cooking with methane. It's not natural gas. That was like a big 1960s US gas company scheme. So you are cooking with methane if you have a gas stove. Your home is likely heated with methane. And when the methane is burned in your gas furnace, it's not emitting the methane, it's being burned. But every aspect of the methane life cycle, like from extraction to transportation to burning, there's leaks. So every aspect, there's leaks in the pipelines, in your home, and the methane that is leaked from your stove causes asthma in children and is linked with dementia and other health impacts. And there are also very significant health impacts of extracting methane through fracking, which is done in British Columbia, the Midwest United States. That's where we get most of our methane gas. And so there's significant health impacts of, quote, natural gas. And the gas companies are out there calling it a clean, transitional fuel that is going to help solve the climate crisis, when in fact, we know that it's actually a huge part of the problem.
I'll jump in, sorry not to, to dominate here, but another answer to your question as well, another thing that I think is not talked enough about, and it's this methane issue, is that there's a real negative sentiment towards plastic, and that is merited. However, it's become kind of the number one thing, and this is where things are very challenging for consumers to make decisions. But I'll talk specifically about our experience at Fieldless. Everybody wants us out of plastic clamshells, right? Our lettuces are in plastic clamshells. We use a recycled PET plastic clamshell. And everybody wants you out of it. It's really hard to get out of a plastic clamshell for lettuce, because if too much oxygen gets in, the lettuce goes bad quickly, then you have waste, and that's a cause of, you know, greenhouse gas emissions. People want to see it, so it needs to be clear, because they're not just going to buy it if it's like, if you can't see it at all. And so there is the kind of good PR thing that you could do right now, which is switch to a quote-unquote compostable plastic, or not plastic, that some people tend to try and call it, container. The problem with compostable plastic containers is that they're not actually compostable. What happens is, I mean, they are technically not in a backyard composter, but in a commercial composter. The problem is that there's these big tubes in commercial composters where the compost goes in and they get heated up. And there's what's called residence time, how long the item sits in there in order for it to break down. The problem with these plastic containers, these quote-unquote compostable plastic containers, is that they don't break down in a very fast period of time. And so they need to run them through the tunnel multiple times, which they won't do because they have a constant flow of biogenics coming in, and they got to process it. So they pull it out and it goes to landfill. When that thing is in landfill, if it was regular plastic, it likely would not break down, and it would almost essentially be sequestered carbon at that point. If it's a compostable plastic, it is going to break down in an oxygen-starved environment, and you get methane. And so all of a sudden, this choice you thought was better is significantly worse. And sorry to, you know, I like having this soapbox because this is a big issue of mine, to explain this issue, because I think it answers your question perfectly, which is this is a key issue that we do not talk about and don't understand.
This also speaks to why we cannot solve this problem as consumers, because like how can you grapple with any of this?
Exactly. I mean, that's a government policy thing through and through, and like the ban on plastics is good, but it's a little bit misguided because it's driving us towards some perverse outcomes.
Let me just try and tease Jon a little bit, because he comes from the agriculture sector, and if cattle were to be a nation, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gas. What would you want to say to that?
Sorry, I missed the beginning.
If cattle were to be a nation, were to be a country, they would be the third largest emitter.
Yeah, absolutely. Gases. Cattle, I believe, is responsible for 68% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the food sector, and 18% of the calories we eat. So it's pretty lopsided.
Quick solution then is to stop eating meat.
A quick solution is definitely to stop eating meat. Of course, not a lot of people are going to do that.
Just stop eating beef.
Just stop eating beef would make a big difference.
Plant-based.
But beef is good, and people like it. And so we need ways of figuring out how to make the impact of eating beef significantly lower.
But some of these Beyond Beefs are pretty good, too.
So good, so good.
Rehana, did you want to add to that question, or?
It's unrelated to methane, but I was going to talk about drought because, you know, the flip side, you know, as far as, you know, climate risk, you always see the images of flood, you know, flooding is you know, impactful a lot of times. And, you know, here when we live close to the Great Lakes, we think about this abundance of water and whatnot, but, you know, think about other parts of Canada too. Drought is a real risk, and people often forget the flip side of that. And that, of course, relates back to agriculture as well. So as far as, you know, risks that perhaps don't get the attention that they deserve, I would look at drought as one of them for sure.
Well, absolutely, and not just drought in our country. I mean, we've had lettuce shortages here, and not to talk my issue again, but just generally shortages from the breadbasket of California feeding all of North America, and droughts had a massive impact. And now all of a sudden, they have so much rain that the crop fields are flooded that we're also going to have an impact. And so it's not really just a matter of, oh, they have all this rain finally, and we're good for like a few more years at least. But no, there's significant problems.
I'm just going to read this question. How do we know that humans are causing climate change?
Science.
Good answer.
Good answer.
We are feeling warmer. That's the proof.
Yeah, this one's pretty broad. How can we as citizens help our planet? Rehana, do you want to tackle that first?
Sure. I think we talk. Okay, let's look at it like layers, right? Look at it like layers of protection. You know, we as citizens also have voices. We can advocate for that. We can, you know, advocate for the policies that we want to see, because you've raised a good point, and you've raised a good point, John, that these decisions are nuanced, right? We have to also, I would say, educate ourselves about the ways in which, you know, we do the accounting. Right? I think that's you know, as a citizen, starting to educate oneself about the way that the accounting happens, looking at the levels of cascading impacts, I think is helpful. I think lobbying for it makes a difference, and I think also it, you know, where the decisions are a little more straightforward, less beef, those are ones that you can embody. I also think have an adaptation mentality, right? I mean, that, you know, again, I'm going to always talk about the adaptation side of it. I see it as we're here and we have to live with you know, the impacts that we have caused, right? You know, be risk aware, right? And be risk aware for kind of the future jobs that you are looking for, right? Look at a way that you can net contribute to the solution, because it is really hard to make every single nitty-gritty decision right, and it feels overwhelming to be that person who is trying to toe the line. Then it's almost like, oh my God, I've got to give up, right? No, I think you pick the area where you've got the most expertise, right, in order to make the difference, and you direct your effort to that.
I'll jump in. When I talk about taking action, I usually use the micro, meso, macro framework. So, I mean, we can all take action in our personal lives. The top 4 things we can do: eat less beef, drive less, fly less, like stop taking short haul flights, just take the train to Montreal. And finally, switching the way you heat your home and insulating your home. So switch to an electric heat pump if you need a new furnace. I can talk a lot about that from my personal experience, but come find me afterwards. So those are like the top 4 things you can do in your own personal life. Also divest, take your money out of fossil fuel sector. Then at the meso level, whatever it is that you do in your job, I'm a health professional, but whatever it is that you do in your job or in your neighborhood or in your faith community, get involved. Maybe make your workplace more sustainable, make your neighborhood have more bike lanes, plant a community garden. And then macro level, I mean, we can all be talking about this issue more with our friends, our family, our neighbors, our politicians, and really talk about it as a health issue. And, you know, talk to our friends about all the changes that we're making at that micro and meso level.
So as an individual, we are empowered. We have a lot of power. As I want to go back to my opening remarks I made, and that as an individual, we are a consumer. We are a voter. So that's where our power is. Now, to build on to what Dr. Green just mentioned about divesting your money from fossil fuel, as a consumer, we have that power. And you may be surprised to know that approximately 90 big companies in the world are responsible for 2/3 of greenhouse gas. So if a consumer, you know, had the power to move that money it is estimated that $300 billion could be moved to green economy, and that can make a big difference.
So, just for the sake of being a panel that needs to have some disagreement and debate.
I was wondering who was going to start that.
It's not that I don't believe in personal actions can make a difference, because I do, and all the things you say make an absolute difference. The problem I have with that is we're asking people who care, which is a growing minority, so a minority that is growing, to make sacrifice, while those who aren't paying attention, don't care, are more frivolous and just do what they want. And so instead, what I always try to tell people is, like, if you really want to make a difference, seize the opportunity, take something you're expert in, and figure out how you can amplify that and how it can become exponential, and how you can actually focus your attention, your daily, day-to-day, on something that can make exponential change in a positive way that allows, and I know everybody can't do this, and I'm not saying that everybody can, but I'm saying think about maybe you can. And hopefully maybe try and inspire others to make that exponential change where your actions basically result in thousands of actions as opposed to just your singular actions.
I agree. Just one point is, yeah, we live in a system that revolves around burning carbon, so like none of us can be perfect. And also, I think people really want to practice the hope that they want to see. Like when people learn about the extent of this problem, they want to take action. And you know, the easiest way to take action is just in your own house, like with your own family. So
100%.
Yeah.
I agree.
What role will solar panel technology play in helping reduce greenhouse gases?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah. What
can you repeat the question?
Absolutely. What role will solar power technology play in reducing greenhouse gases?
I think one of the problems we have in Canada with solar is that we have a very myopic view of solar because we don't live super close to the equator and we don't have the major solar resources that a lot of the world has. In many places in the world, if you get rid of subsidies, solar is, I believe now, that I'm going to look at Zach over here, solar is now the cheapest form of electricity when you look at the levelized costs. Or no, maybe? It's getting close. Yeah, it's getting close. It will get there.
It's actually grown cheaper than even fossil fuel right now. So it's, if the question is what role it will play, I would say it will play a major role, because right now solar and wind represent about 13% of all the power for electricity and so on. So there is such a big gap here. And it is estimated that if solar, and it will take 10 to 20 years because the grids, have to keep pace with that.
But it won't anymore take 10 to 20 years. It won't.
It may not now, which is good.
No.
In the US, we have just seen that the investment that is directed to the solar power, the grids cannot keep pace with that. Right? So we have to have that lag time. So I would say, maybe 10 years or so. Now, in that time, what you will find is that because of the capacity of solar energy, it can power the whole world 100 times over. And that's the power it has.
We can power the whole world with solar, wind, and hydro. End of story. And lots of engineers have modeled that. It can be done in the next 10 years in every jurisdiction. So it's definitely doable. And for some reason, the current Ford government is asking for an increase in natural gas-powered electricity, which is harmful for health, and which, as you've heard, natural gas is just methane, which is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas. So yeah, we should be maybe advocating against an increase in natural gas-fired electricity, because our electricity grid has been, in the last 10 years, actually quite clean since we got rid of coal. And instead, we need to be investing more in solar, wind. Even offshore wind on Lake Ontario has been modeled as quite effective, and hydro.
So I just want to clarify one point. solar in Canada is good or not? Is sufficient?
It is good. It's
is
just
sufficient.
a little more expensive than in other countries at this point.
The cost for the panels or something different? Just setup of infrastructure?
Sorry, I should say the return on the investment is not as good.
But it's decreasing. It's
decreasing
really going down.
rapidly.
Just want to make this clear. I'm looking to buy a solar system, which is why I'm curious.
Go to Europe.
I can be cheeky at times. You have time for one more? Last question. Okay, we'll find one here.
This is going to be a doozy.
I'm looking, yeah. This is a good question. Rehana, I think this is mostly for you. Would you please share thoughts on what the City of Toronto is doing to prepare for potential flooding? We have many flood-prone zones, and hopefully preventative work is underway. And I find that really fascinating in terms of question, because we had that event a little while ago where water was going into the subway station downtown. And I think that's for people who are living here, that's a good question.
Well, that definitely sounds like my bread and butter. And now I don't work for the City of Toronto. I work for the Conservation Authority, but definitely I can kind of speak to what municipalities look at. As I talked about, it's not the kind of thing where it's a silver bullet, right? You have to look at the layers of protection. And the first thing that happened after Hurricane Hazel came through back in 1954 was this idea of trying not to put people in risky areas. And so this has worked well for kind of the outer suburbs, that are the areas that have been built after that kind of policy was in effect. But of course, the City of Toronto in particular, in the older neighborhoods and all the old downtowns, even of the suburbs, were all built next to rivers, because rivers provided power, they provided water, they provided fish, they provided, humans have always settled next to rivers. And so you have to layer these things on. So examples would be some of the big flood mitigation work. People don't even realize that Corktown Common is actually a flood protection landform. It's a great example of that, because there you have a layer of infrastructure protection and amazing green space, a great splash pad, a place to cool off on hot summer days, a place to access some of that nature for 20 minutes a day. And so that's an example of kind of the infrastructure piece. But you have to recognize it's a long game, right? Adaptation, the need for it is so high, but the availability of funding is stretched thin among all of these different projects that merit funding, right? That need it. It's the same pot of money that needs to be accessed for social housing as well as for flood protection infrastructure. And so everything is stretched thin. We have to understand that.
We're just worried about that later.
And so we have, so layers of flood protection like that. There's work going on the islands right now. There's environmental assessments happening in one of the most flood-prone neighborhoods in the GTA, which is along Black Creek. And so you have the infrastructure. Then you have forecasting and warning systems, right? Where there's leveraging this technology, that power of human innovation, right? And the things that we can do now with where we are with technology and advancement in that. And I would say the other side of it is, of course, education and outreach, right? And having discussions like that, making people more aware, understanding that that there is a lot of work that can be done, but there's always going to be some residual risk as well, right? And people have to look at options to reduce that on their property, to look at financial ways of reducing risk, like insurance and whatnot, and all of these have to come together kind of throughout the full spectrum.
I have a quick question. Are we going to stop calling it the 100-year storm?
Oh gosh, I try to call it the 1%. And remember, Hurricane Hazel is not the 100-year storm, right? The actual volume of rainfall is even bigger. But this should, to me, this should be the thing that people realize. Hurricane Hazel has happened. It already happened, right? And to think that the idea of a flood like that is some far off thing is misguided. I feel like I'm working against the clock as to what can I get done before it happens again.
Isn't everything in Toronto designed to that, though?
Well, remember Toronto.
No, to Hurricane Hazel.
No. So two things to remember. So an infrastructure system, right, like a storm drainage system, right, is built to channel water, that comes from more intense storms. So the 1 in 100-year storm, in a sense, is more intense in terms of how much in a short period of time, right? The thing you have to remember, though, is these cities were built before we had that level of protection too. Like old storm drainage systems, it was just, you know, get the kind of storm that would happen once every 2 years, just get that into a pipe. And then we looked at, okay, well, we have to look at the pipe and we have to look at the street because the curb is there to hold back water and direct it as well. And then wait a minute, well, what if there's too much? Now we've got to put a pond in place. But wait, if we put a pond in place, you know, it's still moving the water too quickly. We've got to infiltrate it into the ground where it is. So stormwater management has evolved over the time, but we don't live in a new city that has been only built since we've had modern stormwater management. The other thing to remember is Hurricane Hazel happened also before this was built. So there's a lot of these, what I call like historical flood-prone areas, right, that are there. And there's also been infrastructure modifications. We modified the landscape a lot. So, you know, to think that we're immune to it, absolutely not. In fact, there's about 40 clusters in the Greater Toronto area that are at risk of flooding. And, you know, tackling them one by one with a mix of these efforts is the plan.
So essentially, preventive measures are underway, but there's still that big risk that you need to be planning for.
I'm very excited about the new park. There's a park the size of High Park that is being built as part of the Don River flood mitigation, and I live right downtown, so I'm very excited about that.
Absolutely, that's a big one, game-changing one underway.
Well, that was our final question. Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you. For the final part of the event, I would like to call on Bida Parvesh, Associate Curator at the Aga Khan Museum, to talk about the themed installation, Water, currently at the museum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody, for sharing this evening with us. And thank you so much, all the panelists, for the wonderful conversation that we had. And one thing that I can say after listening to everything is, like, we all hope that we can play a part, and then it's a shared responsibility to tackle the climate change. So we also had the museum, so we wanted to take part, thinking about how we can make it related to the to play our part actually in this global situation in the world. So we do have a collection of 1,200 objects roughly at our museum, which around 230 are on display at any given time. Many of them are manuscripts. So we have to, after 6 months, we have to change them anyway, just to limit the number of exposure. And for every 6 months, they have to rest for around 3 years in dark to be ready to go back on display. So for one of these rotations or themed installations, we thought about how we can tie it to one of the themes that we can raise awareness about the things that is happening in the world. So we thought that because we had World Water Day and also Earth Day happening, so we talked about the theme of water and looking at the historic examples that we have in our collection, which is ranges from roughly 9th century to 20th century in our collection, to talk about the significance of water throughout history, through our collection. So here are some of the examples that I just wanted to show you, and I hope you've seen it already, but if not, I just hope that, invite you to come and see the installation that we have. So some of the themes that we are exploring as part of this rotation is water at home and in the community. This is a 16th century fountain that we have on display from Egypt that was most likely was actually inside a building in a roofed residency. That how it also was part of the community, but also helped with the regular household chores or rituals during the day, but also the cooling effect that it was bringing to the atmosphere, being probably somewhere in the basement of the building and help that circulation of air. And then we have a historic 16th century painting of a bathhouse, that how it was a communal space for people to gather and spend time when, they were doing also their regular hygienes. But also the folio on the right, for example, it's a busy market in the 16th century India that give us a glimpse of how water was shared in that probably hot day in that market, and then it was consumed in that time and space. The other, which also, like those two also talk about this theme about the importance of access to clean water and sanitation. And this example here is actually from 12th century, again from Egypt. That was one of the early examples that was used to filter water, like through like a big jar that was stand on it, and helped helped to filter water for access to for the community again. So again, water was as important in travel and trade, and these albarelli that we have, there are pharmaceutical jars probably used during trading spices by way of water probably. But then these are exciting for us because, I mean, we know that they were made in Syria, but the coat of arms that has been used on it is actually like from Florence. That shows that these items probably also took a water journey from Syria to Italy at one point. But also for transmission of knowledge, connecting people, migration. So water has been always an important route for all these communication between people throughout time. I'm not going to go to the details here, but we have several examples that talks about the symbolic meanings of water, how water has been presented in literature, or how it has been like likened to life itself, that it throws unpredictable waves at you that you have to tackle in your life. We look at water and rituals through several examples that we have on display, and water and spirituality, such as that. The one on top, the shell that you're seeing, it's been inscribed with Quranic verses, and then it was used to probably like carry some water, to sip water for that spiritual purposes. But then also the fact that this shell was somehow protecting the body of the animal that was in it, and then it was in the water nourished that animal, and then the water carried that shell that is somehow reached to the shore and then being carved by the person. So the many ways that water is kind of plays a part in that one object. And also several of our Quran manuscripts be open on verses that talks about the importance of water, rain, like, or different like ways that water has been discussed and represented in the Quran. And also like one of the examples as how it has been looked at the water in the gardens and garden itself as a vision of paradise. And that's one of the reasons, if you've been to our collection, you see many examples of gardens being painted in several of our manuscripts, and that's one of the symbolic meanings of gardens. And one important aspect is the role of water in making. Without water, literally like half of the items that we have on display would never be even been produced. Like we would never have paper, like paper making, transmission of knowledge again through the role of paper, textiles, silk production, the ceramics themselves. Water is like, of course, like a very important aspect of the clay itself and the ceramic making process. So again, without that, we didn't even have these items. And last but not least, we wanted to make sure we hear young people's voices. Yes, these are our historic examples, but how about today? So in the middle of the exhibitions, we have one display of 7 photographs taken during a workshop that we had actually in 2019, that we invited some students, young students from our neighborhood from this community, that they're mostly newcomers to Toronto, to Canada, and then we had this workshop with famous photographer Frederick Robert, and we asked the students to work around SDGs, to capture images that talks to them related to the 2013 SDGs. So the ones that we are highlighting here at this point are the ones that are related to the theme of water, and we reached out to the students, and they provided us with statements about what it means for them when they captured these images, and what's their hope for the future, and how they think that they can play a part in a better future and tackling the issue. And we are actually it's still not confirmed, we are working on it, but we are hoping to, we are working with an institution to set up a walk kind of excursion to go outside, actually to look at the water that was actually in the site that we are we are here now. So the lost rivers of Toronto, we want to plan a walk that starts in our garden all the way in the Don Valley. So we want to look at the several bodies of water that were before in Toronto and how they have changed and evolved throughout time. And yes, if you're at the museum, thank you so much. So that's the sticker that the items that have been changed, we give them that sticker. So that kind of provides you a path how to go and then explore the journey related to the theme of water in our gallery. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Bita. I'm sure everyone's excited to come and see that exhibition. Would be really excited to go on that walk to see the lost rivers in Toronto. There's quite a few of them. I want to thank everyone again for participating. Our panelists, Bita, Zakia, you've all inspired us today and reinforced the importance of taking action to lessen the impact of climate change. I now call on Zahida Daya, Honorary Secretary for the Aga Khan Council for Ontario, Committee for Toronto, for closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Salima. So it's my pleasure to bring this wonderful event to a close. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our MC and moderator, Salima, for her wonderful job. Thank you so much. Thank you, Zakia. Thank you, Bita. But to our panelists as well, thank you for an incredibly enlightening and thought-provoking conversation. Thank you for your passion and your candor. I know I've learned something from each and every one of you, and you've inspired me, and I'm sure the others in the room as well, to take some action with all the practical opportunities that you've shared with us. So thank you so much. And, you know, on that note, Ismaili Centers are symbolic markers of the core values of the Ismaili community, which include pluralism, intellectual engagement, and reflection and contemplation. This discussion today has certainly exhibited those attributes, and it has been an honor to host not only our esteemed guests here today, but also friends from all parts of the Toronto community. And climate change is perhaps the most pressing issue of our times, and one that requires communities to come together to find solutions. But there is hope, and you've inspired us again that there is hope. On behalf of the Aga Khan Museum and Park and the Ismaili Centre Toronto, I want to thank our guests for being so generous with their time and knowledge this evening. I would also like to acknowledge the tremendous efforts of the volunteers from our planning team. We have our incredible AV team, our hospitality team, all of which have devoted their time to ensure tonight's event is seamless. So thank you. Thank you so much. And before we conclude the formal part of our program, I just want to remind you that the Ismaili Centre Toronto, the Aga Khan Park, and the museum host many programs and events throughout the year. So please look for us on social media, go to our websites for more information, and continue to join us at our events. And finally, thank you all for joining the event today. This concludes the formal part of our event, and we'd like to invite you outside for refreshments and more dialogue. So thank you so much.